Okay, well, let's begin. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first American Cetacean Society SF Bay Chapter Speaker Event of 2021. I'm Susan Hopp, a board member, and I'm here with fellow board member Gail Koza. If you're not familiar with the American Cetacean Society, we are the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and grants toward marine research. We hope you will donate in support of our mission by going to our website, and we have it in the chat. No donation is too small, and it will really help us, especially cover our Zoom costs to do these webinars. And I think we'll be doing this format, online format, for most of 2021. So we're really excited to kick off 2021 with a focus on the climate crisis and its impact on our oceans and wildlife. We're recording this session, and we encourage you to put questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to them when we open it up to our audience Q&A. Now, we have a distinguished panel of scientists with us for this conversation tonight, and I would like to first introduce them. So first, Dr. Cara Field is the medical director at the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito, which is the largest marine mammal hospital in the country. Dr. Field completed her dual doctor in veterinary medicine and PhD program at UC Davis in 2005, where she studied the effects of high pressure on blood platelets from elephant seals, which are the deepest diving animal on the planet. And before coming to the Marine Mammal Center in 2014, she worked at some of the largest aquariums in the country. And during the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, she oversaw the care of oiled sea turtles and dolphins as the primary vet for the Audubon stranding program. At Marine Mammal Center, her primary roles include overseeing the care of all stranded marine mammal patients on site, conducting and collaborating on numerous research projects, and teaching and mentoring the Marine Mammal Center staff and visitors. And next I'll go to Marc Webber. And Marc is a marine biologist with a 30-year career at the US Fish and Wildlife Service. For a good many years, he was manager of the 4 million acre Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, home to over 60% of North America's breeding seabirds, and the habitat for threatened populations of stellar sea lions, polar bears, and northern sea otters. Marc is the co-author of Marine Mammals of the World, a comprehensive guide to their identification. He's also co-founder of Golden Gate Cetacean Research, and he is a research associate at the Cal Academy of Sciences and the Marine Mammal Center. Sara Hutto is the Ocean Climate Program Coordinator for the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. And she integrates climate smart adaptation into sanctuary management and provides training for managers around the country to undertake climate smart adaptation planning. Sara's background is in rocky intertidal ecology, and she holds a Master of Science in Marine Science from Moss Landing Marine Laboratories. So we're really happy to have these esteemed scientists with us for this discussion, this very relevant discussion this evening. But what I'd like to start with, before we engage our panelists, is just to establish some context and review what I like to say are some of the essentials of our climate crisis. So I'm just going to share my screen here and bring up just a few slides. I'm not going to overwhelm our audience with slides, but what I want to do is, again, just to establish some context. So what do we know about the state of our climate? Well, first, if we look at the history over the last 800,000 years of atmospheric carbon dioxide, we see that it has ranged between 180 and 300 parts per million. If we then look at the temperature range in this same time horizon, we see that it correlates pretty much exactly to CO2 concentration. And then further, if we look at what the 2019 concentration was, which was 419 or 415 parts per million, you really see how out of whack this is throughout the historical variations. And if we are to continue in the next 40 years at the current rate of increase, well, it's just really, it's unthinkable when we're already seeing a lot of effects of our climate crisis. So effectively, what we are doing is we are upsetting the natural greenhouse effect of our atmosphere, which has really given us the warmth and the stability in our climate for so long. And what we're doing is really overwhelming our atmosphere with heat trapping pollution. And where is this coming from? It's coming from the burning of fossil fuel that we've used for energy in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas. And you can see how it's just really taken off since the Industrial Revolution began. And of course, as our economies of the world have grown, so has our burning of fossil fuels. So effectively, what we are doing is spewing 152 million tons of man-made warming pollution into our thin shell atmosphere every 24 hours. And what have been the results? Well, in the last, in the hottest years on record have been since 2009, and the last 5 have been the hottest ever. And that actually has continued with 2020. NASA just recently came out with their analysis that essentially showed 2020 tied with 2016. So then the question is, well, where is all this heat? Where is from global warming, where is it going? On a global scale, the oceans are absorbing 93% of this heat. And one byproduct of this heat is that it makes ocean-based storms like hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons stronger, more destructive, and more frequent. And we certainly saw this last year. And also, again, tracking with our accumulation of CO2 in our atmosphere, you can see that half of all the heat absorbed has really been since 1997, 50% of it. The other things that are happening based on this accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions is that the chemistry of the oceans are changing, and it's culminating in ocean acidification. So since the Industrial Revolution, there's been a 30% increase in ocean acidity. And of course, one of the byproducts of that is we're seeing the demise of a lot of our coral reef systems. And then of course, there's global ice melt. And not only is this contributing to sea level rise, but it's changing ocean habitat. And I'm sure our panelists will have some things to say about that. But I want to leave this essentials or the background of climate change with with something really hopeful, and that is that we can change. And I really like this quote from Michael Mann, who's one of the more well-known vocal climate scientists. And the fact is we have the tools and we can address climate change. We are transitioning to green energy, to renewables, and we can accelerate that. And so what we want to do tonight is just really spotlight that action is possible, and we can change things up here. And so with that, I want to open it up to our panelists and really hear from them on what they're seeing in terms of climate change affecting marine mammals. So let me stop sharing this. And what I'd like to do is kick it off a question, or actually just really ask our scientists to elaborate a little bit and really talk about their work, their current work. So let's start with, maybe we can start with you, Cara Field.
Sure thing. Happy to. Thank you for having me tonight. It's an honor to be here talking to all of you. So as Susan mentioned, I'm the medical director at the Marine Mammal Center. And the Marine Mammal Center is a nonprofit organization that responds to marine mammals in distress, basically. So many of the patients that we admit for health assessment and rehabilitation are pinnipeds, so our seals and sea lions, but we do also respond to cetaceans as well as sea otters and sometimes the occasional sea turtle. So our goal really in responding to these patients, we opened our doors in 1975. So shortly after the Marine Mammal Protection Act was enacted. And since then, our goal are multi-purpose. So obviously we care about the individual animals as our patients, but really one of the most important things that they have to teach us is more about what's happening in the oceans. So why these animals are washing ashore. Sometimes it's due to injury or trauma from other marine mammals, so it's more natural. But many times we're seeing the influence of human-induced diseases, such as entanglements in trash or lost gear. Certainly large whales are unfortunately sometimes hit by ships and die and suffer severe trauma from that. Our sea otters have a whole number of insults. They were hunted as well as many species to near extinction and are still sort of teetering on the brink of recovery. So at the Marine Mammal Center, we're able to take in these animals, treat them, assess them, and everything that we learned from them has a story to tell about the ocean. And some of the things that we've seen lately are very alarming. We're starting to see, for example, in 2015, we had an incredibly powerful warm water event really throughout the entire Eastern Pacific here. And that had a dramatic effect on marine mammals. And we had more animals than ever that year come ashore, wash ashore in very poor body condition, for example. So the animals are really good sentinels for what's happening out there in the oceans. And we eat a lot of the same things that they do. So really, it's incumbent on us to learn from these animals as sort of the top apex consumers and predators in the ocean to see what effects these changes are having, not just on the animals, but can happen to us as well.
Really important points. Good, thank you. How about you, Marc? What are you working on now? Tell us a little bit about your current focus.
Well, thank you, Susan, Gail, and members for having me tonight. I'm glad to be here with you. I have, as Susan mentioned, just retired from a 30-year career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Last posting was in Alaska with a great opportunity to work on the resources of the Aleutian Islands and the Bering Sea, where there are many federal islands and landfalls with incredible marine mammal and seabird colonies. Most recently now, I've relocated to the Midwest with family, to be around family, but I'm continuing to work on marine mammal projects, a little more constrained right now because I can't travel to work on those projects, but I've got ongoing work. You mentioned our Golden Gate Cetacean Field Research Group. Well, it's now part of the Marine Mammal Center. Maybe those of you in ACS San Francisco Bay don't all know that yet, but we've we've merged into the Marine Mammal Center. Really feel grateful to be involved with all the good things that Cara's describing are going on, and to bring a field research focus to that program for cetaceans. So we are bringing our work in on bottlenose dolphins, harbor porpoises, humpback whales in particular, and also California gray whales as they wander into San Francisco Bay. So that work's kind of focused on the Gulf of the Farallones Bay Area specifically. Then, as you said, I'm working on a new, starting work on a new edition of our guide to the marine mammals of the world with Tom Jefferson and Bob Pittman. And one thing that's becoming clear to me is that's going to be kind of our own little referendum on changes going on for marine mammals, because each species we analyze its distribution. And I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of changes are going to be documented, can be documented since we started the project in 2007 or even 5 for the first edition, through the second and now to this one, where we'll be noting any changes to distributions of marine mammals around the world. And I think it's gonna be a real interesting and revealing exercise.
Yeah, it seems that you really can't, any part of study of marine mammals now cannot be separate from the issues of climate change. So looking forward to having that even more illuminated in this conversation. Sara, how about you? Certainly not last, but not least. Tell us about
Thank you, Susan. It's great to be here with Marc and Cara and the rest of you. So the program that I run, the Ocean Climate Program, it's a partnership between the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, which is a federal agency, and our partnering association, the Greater Farallones Association. And we really have 3 main areas of focus. The first being how can we train other marine protected area managers and develop tools for them to use in order to understand how climate change is impacting their marine and coastal resources, and then what can they do about it. So I get to travel a lot pre-COVID and work with resource managers around the world and around the country to talk with them about how do we plan for this really dynamic situation that we find ourselves in, and how can we be innovative and come up with new solutions. The second area of focus for me at the Farallones Sanctuary is to develop new programs to address some of our emerging threats. So for example, in response to the massive bull kelp loss that we experienced on our coastline, up to 95% of our bull kelp was lost. We developed the bull kelp recovery program, where we're really looking to restore those extremely biodiverse habitats that are critical for so many species in the sanctuary. Another program that we run is our whale conservation program to reduce ship strikes and whale entanglements, which are really the leading causes of mortality for some of our great whales, now that whaling is over in the Northeast Pacific. And then really the final area that I focus on that I think is most exciting to share is really advocating for the oceans as a solution to climate change. And in fact, a high-level panel from the UN indicated just last year in the Oceans as a Solution report that the oceans can provide up to 30% of the reductions we need to make in order to get ourselves globally on a more sustainable carbon emissions pathway. So the oceans have a lot of solutions to climate change. And so what I try to do is, yes, a lot of our marine animals and habitats are a victim of climate change, but they can also provide a solution. And just to provide an example that would be interesting, I think, to a lot of you being focused on marine mammals, is that whales can actually accumulate a significant amount of carbon in their bodies, and whales can actually provide a really significant process to sequester carbon in the deep sea. When whales die, and if they sink to the bottom, that carbon is going to be locked away for thousands of years. And I think each whale can sequester 33 tons of CO2 on average. And there have been really great studies that have looked at if we can restore globally our whale populations to what they were pre-whaling, the climate benefit of that is actually incredibly surprising and extraordinary. So I think that is really the most exciting area that's developing right now, is to really leverage our oceans and kind of communicate that they can be a solution to climate change.
Wow, that is just so exciting. You know, I mean, it's all the oceans give us in every way, and that they can continue, just it's like the gift that keeps on giving. Anyway, that is really exciting, Sara. So, well, one of my next questions was really, you know, how is climate change impacting your work? And perhaps all of you have touched on it. And I don't know, Sara, maybe, you know, maybe you start with how your position came to be in terms of this question of, you know, how is climate change impact affecting your work or your research?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll start kind of with that first prompt of how did this even come to be. And I think it's an interesting story. About 15 years ago, the superintendent at Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, Maria Brown, which some of you may know, she found that there was really not much information out there on how climate change is impacting our oceans, and the information that was out there was not well known by our community, by our advisory council, by our staff. And she really felt the need to develop a new program, and that's kind of where the Ocean Climate Program was born. And so since then, we have really worked with our local researchers to gather the data that we need to inform our management decisions, really. So my position is all focused on climate change, but I think in considering how it's impacting my work, it has made me realize that there's no precedent for this and there's no model to follow. And so the number one lesson learned for me working in this field is the need to be flexible and adaptive, and sometimes come up with crazy ideas, and they may turn out not to be so crazy after all, because we're working in a world that we've never seen before. And so that's something I tell all of the managers I work with is, if you have a crazy notion, let's get it out there, let's talk about it. It might not be so crazy, because the model of conservation and restoration is being flipped on its head, and we really have to think very flexibly and be adaptive ourselves.
That's great. I would love to hear both from you, Marc, and Cara, whoever wants to go next. Again, in terms of how climate change is impacting your work.
I guess, oh, hey, Cara, do you want to go first?
No, I was going to say after you, Marc.
Okay. Well, climate change is having a direct effect on a lot of what I do, and certainly most of my thinking. It just seems to be an inescapable fact of everything we think about, like Sara said, seems to be in flux right now to one degree or another. And so you're keeping your eye open for change and documenting that change and trying to assess why change is happening. One of the things we're working on very closely, I am with colleagues out in California, under the lead of one of your board members, Izzy Shapaniak, is a paper that's just about completed on the northward shift of a great number of coastal bottlenose dolphins into the waters north of Monterey Bay, where they've been quite a long time, since the 80s. But going back even a bit further, when I got started with all this, was quite a long time ago. Basically, they weren't north of Point Conception. They really weren't outside the Southern California Bight much. And by the middle 80s, they'd made an incursion into Monterey Bay, and even a few had shown up in San Mateo. But starting in the late 2000s and continuing now, I mean, that's one of the important points. It's not just a short-term effect so far, is bottlenose dolphins have reached all the way up into upper Sonoma County and into touching Mendocino. And a few have even wandered as far north as Puget Sound. And these are coastal dolphins. They're not living out in the deep ocean. They're near shore, living in a thin belt of habitat along the coast. So they're really changing. Things are really changing for them, whether it's directly climate change on their bodies or more likely effects to their food resources that they're following. They're making quite a bit of change happen in their world, and it's spreading out their population. So we're interested in a lot of the conservation implications of that. And for San Francisco Bay Area people, here's a new species in the mix to deal with for recreational boaters to be aware of and cautioned about their behavior to avoid or reduce negative interactions and collisions or disturbance. We've got an interesting animal to document in our bay system now and along our coast. Also gray whales, following on the work of Francis Gulland at the center, the Mammal Center, and Cara and Poreg, their pathologist, Gray whales have gone through have gone through now 2 population reduction events. And the result of that is a lot of gray whales are loitering around our coast in poor condition. And many of them make their way into San Francisco Bay. So another member of our team, Bill Keener, has been actively documenting that along with center staff. And we're trying to keep track of and understand and following what Francis did in the late 1990s, now in this most recent event, and seeing how long it continues. So again, a climate influence effect, because the gray whale population seems to either have hit carrying capacity or the environment has changed underneath them, so to speak, in their benthic habitat, or both, to the point where there are many suffering nutritional stress. So it's pretty far ranging and sweeping, and pretty much all that I'm working on or thinking about these days.
Right.
Some good news, like dolphins, they're changing. Whether, I mean, it seems good. We're seeing them in new places, or maybe some bad news, like gray whales suffering some population mortality.
Cara, what might you add?
Well, actually, these guys set it up incredibly for me. So, following up on what Bill said, as the Marine Mammal Center, we tend to be responding more to what's actively going on. And as Bill said, the unusual mortality event for gray whales right now is ongoing. And that's one of the things that we respond to. So we are able to conduct necropsies or autopsies of those animals so that we can try to get answers and really investigate what's going on. Why are we seeing so many die off? And of course, as you know, the gray whales have an extraordinarily long migration. So this is a massive collaborative effort with our partners from everywhere from Mexico all the way into Alaska, as we study gray whales that have washed ashore and try to understand why that happened. And this season we haven't heard about as many. Last year we had some. The year before was the highest number, and we responded just to 13 gray whales alone here in the in our range, in this 600-mile range of California that we respond to. So as Bill said, it's really important that we not just document these whales' deaths and their body condition, and that's why the partnership between the Cetacean Society and ourselves is so critical, because we have that really important information to give back and forth. So when we get data about the individual gray whales, body condition, what they're doing, and then we're able to conduct a full autopsy or necropsy and try to better understand the cause of death, that's what's going to give us those answers. And of course, we do suspect that probably a change in food availability or maybe quality or something like that has contributed to the starvation of many of these whales. But some of them that seem to be in good body condition, actually, we either did not find a cause of death, or in some cases, you couldn't tell until you opened the whale up, but then you could see that the whale was a victim of a ship strike. And a very large animal like that, there's very few things that are going to cause a really severe blunt trauma and fracture of ribs and vertebrae in a large animal like that. So it's, in addition to getting this information, the other really key factor is to get it out there and to educate people, because it doesn't do us any good to just sit on this information and these findings ourselves. So really being able to reach out, to work with our collaborators, and then get the word out as educators to the community, to let them know what's going on and what our suspicions and what our findings are for these animals, both live and dead. That's really where we can have a more broad impact. So doing good science and then disseminating that to get people involved, engaged, and recruit them to help us understand and find these animals that are doing either washing ashore or even just exhibiting normal behaviors. Because a lot of times folks out there just with their cameras get great pictures of maybe a fluke or a dorsal fin or something like that we can use later to help identify individual animals. So really the collaborative effort is key to getting the word out about the effects of climate change on these animals.
Sara, I know one of the projects you've been working on, and this has come up now with gray whales, is the ship strikes. So we've got a lot of anthropogenic impact on these animals, and the last thing they need are things like ship strikes, right? Which is becoming one of the biggest mortality?
Yeah, it depends on the species, but for our Northeast Pacific populations of great whales, it's usually either ship strikes or entanglements with fishing gear. And so we do feel, since those are kind of the primary anthropogenic stressors and they're fixable, you know, climate change can often feel like, what can we do about it? You know, obviously we have to reduce our emissions. That's what we have to do. But what can we do about whales not being able to find enough food in a given year? What can we do about these warm water events that are causing really low productivity that affects the entire food web? It feels really out of our control. So one of our approaches at the sanctuary is to really manage for the things that we can manage for. If we can remove some of the stressors that we can control, then maybe our species can be more resilient to some of these other stressors that we really have a hard time controlling. So yeah, we feel like if we can reduce the pressure on the populations that exist, then maybe that can help those populations to rebound.
So that kind of brings up things like policy. You know, that of course is, you know, your position, Sara, really came from policy. The marine mammal protection areas, also policy. In terms of just staying on the ship strike, because of course, right outside our door, the Golden Gate, you know, we have a lot of shipping traffic. Has it been difficult, and any of you that are aware of this, has it been difficult to get the cooperation to make the changes that in this particular stressor will, we can reduce the impact?
It's improving. I wish I had the numbers in front of me, and I think we might actually have our whale conservation coordinator on, so she could chime in through the chat with some statistics. But we do try to take, you know, a non-regulatory approach and work with the shipping companies. And from what I've understood, they are very amenable to listening to the problem. And at this point, it's just voluntary speed reductions. We're just asking them to slow down when they enter areas that are known to have high whale concentrations. And I think our cooperation numbers, like the percentage of ships that are cooperating, has been increasing over time. I think we're maybe at 60 or 70%. Jess, Morton, if you're on, you could ping us in the chat with those numbers. But there is a big effort here in the Bay Area, and there's also another huge effort down in the Long Beach, Channel Islands area to also enact these voluntary speed reductions. And I think down there they have Blue Skies, Blue Whales kind of program. So, you know, I think it's improving, and it's really all about raising awareness and educating some of these shipping companies that really small modifications to their schedules could make a huge impact.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We're talking about some of the, you know, in terms of climate change, what are direct links? What are indirect links? And it seems like it's, you know, it's difficult to, I mean, you could even make the case that, you know, as our shipping traffic increases, and if they are being, if they're using fossil fuel, that, you know, they're adding to climate change, right? So, I mean, I'm wondering what any of you would say in terms of your work and both indirect and direct links to climate change.
Well, direct links would be pretty conspicuous out there. For instance, polar living marine mammals, which of course not our area in San Francisco, but marine mammals, including a lot of pinnipeds, polar bears, but also Arctic and Antarctic cetaceans are quite vulnerable to changes in sea ice conditions and ocean conditions. And so from disruption of food webs to migratory corridors to substrate for seals and polar bears, that is absolutely essential for their reproduction and their foraging. These are direct effects that are just unmistakable. And there's quite a bit of work out there. When I started working, I worked on walruses for a number of years for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I remember distinctly when I got started, projections of summer ice-free habitat in the Arctic basin, that is all ice gone, were out as far as 2090 or beyond. And just recently I read something that is now those same kinds of models, that projection has been down-tuned to 2040. And why that's significant is there used to always be persistent multi-year ice in the Arctic, for example, in the Arctic basin. But we're talking about the loss of not only the seasonal sea ice, the retraction of it from its greatest extent in the winter and early spring to its point of small concentration in the polar basin to none. And that removes all habitat that ice inhabiting and ice dependent species require. So like the National Marine Fisheries did a very proactive thing, which was to list several species of ice seals as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, to great consternation of other government agencies and industry, because there was no evidence that their population had declined, but it was evidence of, or it was anticipation of what's coming. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about a direct link for polar marine mammals. It's quite, you can see these things happening, some of these things happening most dramatically earliest on in the most conspicuous places like the polar habitats, which are diminishing under current conditions and change.
And to add to Marc's observations, especially about Arctic marine mammals, in addition to the loss of sea ice and critical habitat, there's a lot of concern for introduction of new pathogens that have not previously been documented or noted among these marine mammal species. So part of that may be increased pressure from humans as we start to utilize these more open waterways, and any refuse or anything like that that is distributed from ships passing through certainly could be added to the basically anywhere in the environment up there. We also very much worry about pathogens such as viruses and bacteria, fungi, different things like that that could be transmitted from animals that wouldn't normally have come into contact with each other, that might be naive to those pathogens. And an example of that is a morbillivirus or distemper that has been documented in northern sea otters now. And certainly a pathogen like that, a virus that can cause, it's the equivalent of measles in people, but really severe respiratory and neurologic disease is something that we worry very much about in species that have never been exposed to those viruses before. And another area in addition to the Arctic, kind of worldwide, is as we see water levels increase and extreme weather events become more severe, we're seeing loss of critical habitat for animals in other areas. So we also work with Hawaiian monk seals, which are critically endangered species. And with water level rises and extreme storms, we're seeing loss of their critical breeding and pupping habitat on beaches and small, very small, short little atolls that are being engulfed down by the ocean. So it's making it harder for those seals to recover when they have less breeding and pupping grounds for the seals to haul out and be safe. And that's, not just in Hawaii, but just an example of how those dramatic weather shifts are affecting multiple populations in all different parts of the world.
Susan, if I could, I would just add one more thing, which I know Cara's had a lot of experience with, particularly in California, but I'm not sure about elsewhere, is harmful algal bloom toxins are burgeoning and now in Arctic habitats, in warmed Arctic habitats. We're seeing high levels of them in places where they haven't been detected, with human health advisories on shellfish consumption at an unprecedented level, and including animals that live in the far north and really never leave the Arctic habitat, like bowhead whales, showing detections of harmful algal bloom toxins like domoic acid in their systems. So those animals, those organisms are proliferating into higher and higher latitudes and blooming more frequently.
And is that because of warming oceans? I mean, is that what you would attribute it to?
I'm not a specialist in it, but that's what I've heard it is attributed to, yes.
It's actually the different algae species that produce harmful algal, that make up harmful algal blooms and produce harmful toxins are, it's really fascinating. There's a lot of factors that go into bloom production, but they are algae. So anything that feeds an algal bloom will certainly feed a harmful algal bloom. So for domoic acid, for example, one of the common algae species that produce it is Pseudonychia australis. And we've definitely seen a massive increase, especially in the last 20 25 years of production of that particular species here in the West Coast, but also around different parts of the world. And the biotoxin it produces causes neurologic disease, also is known as amnesic shellfish poisoning. And of course, we as humans and consumers are very susceptible to that biotoxin as well. So we've definitely seen an increase in that, but it's affected not just by changes in water temperature, but by changes in upwelling and changes in nutrient availability in the oceans as well. So it's not super easy to say climate change is making this happen, but the effects of climate change absolutely are affecting these algal blooms. And even if it's not a direct, because of immediate change in water temperature, but all of the different factors that go into these algal blooms that are affecting runoff, upwelling, again, all those kinds of sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Oh, right, sorry. So fires as another example of extreme weather and climate change. So runoff, these massive fires that we see in California is really altered the landscape, and the runoff into the oceans has changed as well. So again, that additional carbon and energy production for algal blooms can have a big impact as well.
Wow. Stay for a moment on the food supply, the diets of a lot of these animals. I mean, Marc, I know you mentioned you're following the dolphins, going further north. And I'm wondering what your comments, all of you, might be in terms of the resilience of certain animals and how feeding patterns and their prey, how that's going to affect different marine mammals.
Well, just generally, we do a lot of what we call climate vulnerability assessments for sanctuaries, where we look across a number of species and use a standard methodology to understand which of our species and habitats are going to be most vulnerable to the impacts from climate change. And, a typical rule of thumb, and this is pretty intuitive, is species that are generalists. So they have lots of different prey items. They can maybe inhabit different types of habitats, or they have a wide temperature range. So any organism that's more of a generalist is going to be able to adapt to change more easily. And then some of those species that are instead specialists, so they have a really specific food item that they rely on, or a really narrow habitat range, those are really the ones, to be worried about. And then when we have these really significant large-scale changes like the marine heat wave of 2014 and 2015 that completely disrupted the food web, and we see the resulting mass mortality events and nesting failures for all of our seabirds, mortality events with many of our marine mammals. Those are the events that scare me the most, because it almost trumps whether you're a generalist or a specialist, because the change is so significant. And so I really worry about our coastal seabirds, because we've seen time and time again, a warm water year, we have massive nest failures. And some of our marine mammals as well. I think to a certain extent, they may be able to adapt a little bit better, because they have pretty extensive ranges. They can move a bit more, find kind of where the food has moved, or switch food for that year. But even then, these changes are so widespread and extreme that it definitely worries us a lot.
Marc or Cara, would you have anything to add to the concept of resiliency and the ability to adapt across various marine mammals?
I share Sara's concerns about the heat wave events, and we saw a massive die-off of seabirds in Alaska during the Big Blob event, where there was complete failure at colonies that had been monitored for over 40 years, had never had as extensive a set of failures as we saw over a couple of year period in the mid 2010s, 15, 16 area. And lots of birds washing ashore, possibly 1 million birds perished just of common murres alone during that massive die-off in Alaskan waters. So it's extraordinary, and I got a chance to witness that. And our biologists were trying to find ways to assess colonies as quickly as they could to look at how extensive the failures, reproductive failures, where fortunately seabirds are long-lived birds, so they do have, as with many marine mammals, they're long-lived animals that have some resiliency to these perturbations. I think the persistence and the change that is creeping into the scene, cycling kinds of perturbations are one thing, but things that persist for longer periods of time become consequential for populations, more so than sometimes in individual events that animals can sometimes weather their way through with long lifespans. The resiliency of, again, as Sara said, the flexibility of some of these predators, I'd pick out humpback whales as a large whale, as a flexible predator. They can seemingly shift their diet from krill to schooling fishes on a dime, if you will, on a very short-term basis as availability permits. And they seem to be adaptable and moving into inshore habitats as needed, as you see there locally in California, happening as we speak. But other animals, it's more subtle, and you have to worry about pinnipeds, like examples from Alaska with stellar sea lions, or even California with California sea lions. The female who gives birth on one of these relatively few islands that we know as rookeries, is limited in her ability to move because she has to always come back. That pup is a central theme in her life that she has to nourish, replenish, provision, if you will, during her foraging trips. She takes care of it over months of time. So in other words, if she travels out as far as she can, or as long as she can, and there isn't sufficient food, the pup won't continue to gain weight. Or if she's only encountering low quality food, because under warmer conditions, some of the preferred prey of pinnipeds diminishes and is replaced by less nutritiously valuable prey, then the pup may be getting a lot of milk, but it's low fat content milk. So maybe this is a little technical, but the point is there are all these levels of subtlety in the system that I think we have to be very mindful of as to whether or not there is an effect, or whether animals are doing well or not doing well. Just amount of successful foraging trips doesn't mean that they're getting good quality prey necessarily in the case of those pinnipeds. So, but other whales, just back to the humpback whales, in contrast, just the last thing I'll say is that blue whales are probably are more restricted in their dietary preferences, and maybe less adaptable to change, because they don't just switch from krill to fish. They're really krill specialists and a few other invertebrates, but they don't really move over to a fish diet like humpback whales do when they can or need to. So what that means for their future and their recovery that's gone very well in the Eastern North Pacific, we'll have to see. Time will tell. As krill availability does change or fluctuates, if it happens to go down, that'll be the indicator we'd be looking for to be concerned about blue whales particularly.
Yeah.
I would just add to that both Sara and Marc, pointed out exactly. I really don't have much to add to it. Those are exactly the kinds of things that worry us, and especially for sea lions for sure, but also for pinnipeds that are still recovering, like the Guadalupe fur seal. There's really only one main rookery for Guadalupe fur seals for breeding and caring for the pups, and those pups usually stay with their mom, similar to California sea lions, for about 9 months or so. So with a catastrophic loss of prey availability for those moms, maybe 1 year wouldn't make too bad of a difference, but with repeated years and repeated minimal prey availability, we could really see that population crash hard and pretty fast again. And just a reminder that, again, of course, our marine mammals are charismatic and they're in front of us as our birds, much more easy to see. But again, as Sara mentioned earlier, it's the whole ecosystem health that really is so important. So the coral that are far less adaptable to temperature shifts and these die-offs, these larger mammals often can survive for another year or 2 or 3, especially the long-lived species. But those changes that are going on at the smaller ecosystem level definitely can have cumulative impacts that over time are really going to ruin it for all the inhabitants, the coral, the fish, the other invertebrates. So it's all very sort of cumulative, really, over time, and that's why I think so many of us are so worried. We may not always see that immediate impact like we did in 2014-15 with mass strandings of very skinny animals, but over time is where we're going to be able to really see how much worse that may be getting. So again, the time to act is right now.
Well, that's, I think, a good segue to my next question for all of you. And that is this: if you had all power in the face of climate, impact that we're talking about, what actions are necessary and urgent? And you have the power to make this happen. So what are they? What would you do?
I think the primary and most obvious, and really it's getting at the root of the problem, is cutting our emissions. And that takes international, national, state, local level policy, all levels of government. And so, I like the individual actions. I think it is important to consume less, eat less meat, ride your bike more. But really, when it comes down to it, we've got to be politically active, and we've got to push for policies that will get us to a more carbon sustainable future. And we are really running out of time to do that. We really are. And we can't engineer our way out of this. So I think if I had all power, I would put into place a number of things that would cut global emissions, but we need to do it now.
Yeah. Marc or Cara, you're up, either one.
Sara said it so eloquently that I don't really have much more to add. Anything that we can do to cut those emissions is critical. We're running out of time faster than we realize. And a lot of the sort of reasons that folks are giving to not do that are economical and immediate. And I think that's where a lot of sort of resistance to change comes in, is that it's cheaper, it's easier, it's this, it's that. And those are all very valid points. Economically, everybody wants to thrive. But it's not sustainable as we see and as we know. So now is the time to put renewable energy sources into place. We see models working in many smaller countries and areas. Tasmania, I was reading about recently, is basically switched over to renewable energy. And obviously that's a tough model. It's not easy. It's a lot easier to do that with a smaller population that might be better off economically. So, but those are the changes that we have to make, and they have to be pretty drastic, and we have to accept that it will come at a level of economic price. And it's a lot easier for me to sit here and say that if I'm economically doing fine. But that is a change I think we all have to make in our heads and in our actions is now.
Yeah.
But I think it's also trying to realize a future that is not just built off of clean energy, but is more equitable and is not going to be an economic burden for anyone. And the fact that we know these climate-driven natural disasters are costing us so much money, and sea level rise alone is going to cost us so much money, that it's really in our best interest to make that upfront investment. And let's reimagine a better world.
Yeah, and I think the focus now on looking at the opportunity, coal jobs, retraining people, the renewables, it's a huge opportunity. So, Marc, do you have anything to add? And then I think we'll go to Q&A from our audience. But
you've all said it so well. I think the one thing that I spend as much time on as I can, when I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I've been an instructor at university level in Alaska, and done a lot of teaching on various kinds of eco tours, is teaching. And if I could wave that wand and sort of make one thing happen beyond what was said, which was exceptional, right on, is to influence all of our younger generations, and as soon as possible and continuously through their education, on the importance and dependence of us on a healthy planet, so that they grow up with a whole different view of what is good and normal and acceptable and tolerable, and that I can get by without if I have to, and all those things would be. So if we could, all of us, from our own children to any classroom we can get our way into to teach, get there and spread the word as concerned citizens, as experts at whatever we're experts at. Just go and talk about this problem and try and create change that would be lasting in all younger generations.
Yeah, and the good news really is that we know how to do this. And I think probably most of you are familiar with the Project Drawdown, which has researched and documented the original book published in 2017 was 100 solutions that exist today and are in operation. So we know how to do this, and whether and all of us have a place to have a part to play in this. Even if it's your next car purchase or what you're going to do, EVs are just absolutely the way to go, for example. There's a lot that all of us can do. But let's go to the Q&A. Gail, do we have any questions from our audience?
Yeah, we have a few. Let's see. One question, I think this is really kind of getting to a question about how quickly can global warming be turned around if we do things like, do more to protect the whales, for example, so they can absorb more CO2 and keep CO2 contained, and if we do change some of our behaviors and so forth. So the question was, or the comment which became a question was, it is interesting that the heat level spiked in 2020 with so many people staying home, not driving. We heard about skies clearing of smog, sea life returning to bays in Hawaii, positive observed changes in wildlife that seem to be in the opposite direction of what you showed, Susan, on the chart. And so I thought it might be helpful if anyone can kind of comment about, even if we made some dramatic changes today, positive changes to reduce global warming, how long would it take? How long do scientists think it will take for those positive changes to actually have a measurable impact on overall global warming patterns? Do we have any information to share in that regard?
I don't have a very good answer for that. Mark and Cara, feel free to interrupt me if you do. But I wanted to make, I did want to bring up, yeah, it is a really good question. Yeah, I don't know how long it would take. I know there's a lot of change baked into the system, right? So even if the world stopped tomorrow, which it almost kind of did because of a global pandemic, we would have so much heat and CO2 in the atmosphere that we're going to see sea levels continue to rise. I've heard on the order of decades, 10 to 20 years before we would really see any noticeable difference. So there's a lag time, right? There's a big lag in seeing the response that we need to see. But I did want to bring up this whole, pandemic impact on our lives and our CO2 emissions. And yes, emissions did drop globally, but it was at great expense, right? Great economic expense, great well-being expense. That's not the way we want to do it. We can't all be on lockdown to save our planet from climate change. So I think really it's thinking about what are the sustainable solutions that can be sustained over time, that won't drive everyone broke and crazy within just a couple months. But it has, I think this year has provided a lot of really great opportunities. Mark may know more about this, but I feel like I read recently about all the boats the tourist boats up in the Alaska area, the tourism industry up there to go whale watching, and how noisy those boats are. And they provide just constant noise for marine mammals. And the researchers at this station were able to, for the first time ever, observe the whale behavior this summer with complete absence of the vessel traffic noise. And it was a really amazing video. If I could find it easily, I would put it in the chat. But it was remarkable, the changes that they saw. And you kind of wish like, man, I wish we could keep that up, but people want to see the whales, So it's a balance. We can't shut things down completely. But we need to do something that's sustainable.
Yeah,
Great point.
Sarah completely covered that so well. I would only add that I also don't know the exact timeline, but it will take time before we see, if we continued in the vein that we are now, it will take many years before we see an actual return to some sort of semblance of what was maybe normaler during the last century. But I think for all of us, just a reminder, that's the hardest thing is to be patient. We've gotten very used to society that's very sort of instant gratification oriented. Just this pandemic alone, the fact that we've progressed to a point of having actual people being vaccinated right now with vaccines being developed in less than a year and mass produced is unbelievable, unprecedented, and absolutely historic. The last pandemic, the Spanish flu, people were inside for essentially 3 or 4 years. So it's very different, and that's an incredible scientific accomplishment. But it does speak to the fact that we don't have a super patient sort of lifestyle. But that is something that we are going to have to keep in mind, that it's going to take time to see these changes, to see the heat levels start to come down again. So I don't know about you guys, but I already find it very hard to be patient in my day-to-day life. So it's a lifestyle change that we'll have to adapt and get used to and stick with and wait out seeing those changes happen.
Yeah, I think the goal right now is that we need to do this. Yes, the accumulated greenhouse gas emissions are there, but if we can get to zero emissions by 2030, we really can halt the temperature increase.
So that leads to another question. So what are some practical things that the common person can do now to start to have an impact? Any top recommendations from each of you? Other than donating to great causes, like,
I don't always want to go first. Marc and Cara, do you guys want to take this one and I can follow up?
I feel the same way, like I'm hogging the microphone. Okay, Marc, you go first.
Fine.
You go, Marc.
Well, I was to be honest, this is really your bailiwick, Susan. You're about sustainability, about what people do in their businesses and their lives to help develop solutions. I'm actually more of an old field biologist who's wanting to listen and learn about these things. I guess personal responsibility, I agree with what Sarah said, that it has to be on a large scale without question. But also the only thing I can control, except with my voting, and maybe my influencing through education, is just what I do with my own decisions. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. I'm trying to find ways to reduce my footprint whenever I can, and impacts. So, and following the advice of good friends like you, Susan, and others that I know that are quite keen on these specific issues that help make change. I think that's a great way to go, is find people who know what changes are possible and what are easily done. There's more of them that are easier to do than we think. And I think a big misconception in society, and I agree that, with COVID, things crashed hard and caused damage, but it also points out how maybe unresilient we are economically and socially and in a lot of other ways, because we hit bottom so hard and it's caused such distress in many arenas. If we had more resiliency in our lifestyles and in many other ways, in finances, maybe we would reduce our impacts if we were more resilient. I'm just being kind of personal thinking there without having a lot of answers for you.
So I just put in the chat a link to this CNN quiz. And I consider myself pretty informed on how you can reduce your carbon footprint. And I was shocked. It's really fascinating. They have you rank different solutions as to what, and it's, yeah, I think it's from Project Drawdown, but they have you rank different actions according to what you think would be most effective. to cut emissions, and then it tells you what the actual answers are, and it's like impossible to get correct. But I learned a lot and I found it really fascinating. So I'd encourage you guys to take a look at that. And then I feel like the one thing I have to say is not very fun or exciting, but it's consume less. Stop buying stuff, like buy used clothing. That's something I try to do a lot. Don't run out and get new stuff a lot of the time. I mean, to make all that stuff, it produces a lot of carbon. Eating less meat, trying to bike. Yeah, no one's going to stop flying to go see their grandma or their grandkids, right? We're still going to go across the country, not during a pandemic, to visit the people we love. Like, you can't tell people not to get on an airplane. So yeah, individual responsibility is a tough one.
Okay, those are great suggestions. Susan, do you have some as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, for instance, again, I've been driving an EV for 4 years now, and you'll just never go back. And transportation for the state of California contributes 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So anything we can do to make that conversion to electric vehicles. A lot of cities now and municipalities are converting their fleets to EVs. I mean, that's really important. Sara mentioned diet. Diet is actually huge. If you look at the carbon footprint of, say, the beef industry, and also it contributes to deforestation and water pollution. So really moving more and more to a plant-based diet can really have a lot of impact. And the thing I like is that all this reverberates. And so then our policymakers start to see this. And it all really adds to the momentum of the changes that we need. So, and also spreading the word. I'm pretty involved in sustainability. I also recommend the Al Gore Climate Leadership course, which is really fantastic. And you can go to climatereality.org, I think it is, and you can find out about that. So, and really talking this up. I mean, I was very thrilled. I have a cousin who never believed in climate change and sent me a video, and it was from climate denial, but basically it has shifted from climate denial to, oh, we can never go 100% renewables. And, oh, we can only do it if there's subsidies. But people don't realize that the oil industry, it's something like almost $700 billion of subsidies. And I have sources for all of this. So, there's a lot that we can do. And the more people that are on board, the better chance we have to save our beautiful planet.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I just wanted to add to that a reminder that plastic is made from oil, from hydrocarbons. And, in addition, as you guys pointed out, plastic is definitely a big one. But just bearing that in mind and remember how incredibly rapidly the social relaying of different stories and things can really truly affect change. And I know it's just one small example, but people switching from plastic straws. I know it's just a small example, but it was an incredibly mighty movement that so many places felt like that was something that they could sort of hold on to and change, that they could move away from plastic straws. It's one piece of plastic, but it's such a great start, and it got such an amazing social movement and momentum behind it that we can do the same for other things as well. And I think that our sort of social pressure affecting economics is such a powerful tool in our arsenal. So getting the message out there, making the stories very relatable for people, and making it obvious to them that, yes, you as an individual can make these changes, incorporating all of those things. And you can get the word out to your friends, and that will lead to a much more broad and global impact. And I think those sustainable seafood, every aspect of it is important, but I think the economic power that we have through social media, through outreach is incredibly powerful tool. And people are excited. A lot of people really do want to change and want to improve and want to preserve what we have for their kids and grandkids. And a lot of people just don't know what to do. So I think we just have to continue to spread that word, like, yeah, make these little changes, use renewable resources, move away from plastic, all of those things make a difference.
I'll add one idea. And I've contacted Amazon a couple times, but if you order a lot of things online, you can speak up to those companies you're purchasing products from and ask them to use recyclable packaging or packaging without plastic. I've noticed that some of my Amazon deliveries now come with no plastic, which is huge. So the more companies like Amazon and others hear from us that we do not want plastic products in our packaging, the more likely they are to respond to that. So just a suggestion.
Yeah, be vocal, be loud.
Yes, be vocal. Okay, another question that arose is someone mentioned that their adult kids gave them a book called Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Wondering if any of you have read it and if you think that there were any key points in that book that resonate and are worth sharing with this group. Does anyone recognize that book?
I can say that that I'm reading it too. Hi, Mickey. And I found out about it because I found a list of an article on the best climate change stories, or in fiction. And it's a very popular book, apparently, because I had to wait list for my library, and I've started reading it. And I think the power of it is that it starts out with just an incredible heat wave in India. And I think what the power of it is it brings to life what could be if we just continued on this trajectory. And there's a lot of really great facts. It's interspersed with, it's set a little bit in the future, obviously, and it intersperses a lot of the facts and the whole intergovernmental panel on climate change and some of the facts, and a few steps forward, some steps backward. So yeah, I really recommend it. But I think, Mickey, you're ahead of probably anyone. But yeah, I think it's a really good. It's definitely you want to keep reading. It's a good book, Ministry of the Future.
Okay, and another question that we have is, which international organization has the authority to coordinate and monitor all of the various climate efforts of various nations? Is there any one organization that has that authority? Maybe Sarah, is that something you're able to speak to?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't have a ton of experience, but I mean, what comes to mind is COP, the Conference of the Parties, and that is administered through the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, UNFCCC, in case usually you just see the acronym. But the next Conference of the Parties is coming up. It's called COP26, so it's the 26th of this meeting, and it is an international meeting. It's going to be in Glasgow, Scotland in November of this year. It was supposed to be in 2020, and they delayed it to 2021 because of the pandemic. But that is really where all the nations come together, and thankfully our nation will participate this year. At the last one, our federal government did not, but we had a lot of state representatives participate, including California, which is, as many of you probably know, has been a great leader when it comes to climate change policy internationally. But this is where all the nations come together and make agreements and commit to certain reductions. So I'm not sure if that's really what the question is getting at, but that would probably be the international body that deals with climate change. Can I post a link? Sure. Yeah.
And I think it's more than noteworthy that one of the first things that President Biden has done, was to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, which
Yeah,
came out of
fantastic.
COP. Yep.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. Another question is around the coral reefs. There are many restoration efforts going on right now to help increase coral reef resilience, to resupply coral reefs. Can any of you speak to how those efforts are going? Is anyone knowledgeable about this?
I feel like Sarah, you might be the best person to answer this.
I could really just tell people where to go, but do you have anything to say
Great.
first, Cara?
Not really. I have some colleagues who I know are working on some coral reef restoration projects, and it is complicated. But part of the problem is that the problem hasn't gone away. So the changes in water temperature that either kill the coral outright, or cause bleaching, or that we have some microbes out there that have adapted and might be harmful to the corals themselves. So the problem is definitely restoration can be really helpful and beneficial, but the problem, the increase in water temperature and change in acidity of the ocean is part of the bigger problem that has not been fixed yet. So definitely, I know a lot, those efforts are very, very noteworthy and applause-worthy, and I know a lot of people are working really hard to grow corals in different programs and restore them, but it does take time, and coral is, of course, rather slow growing as well. Yeah, so it also comes down to having to actually change the water so that the new coral, the restored coral, can thrive as well. But Sarah, back to you, sorry.
Oh no, that's great. I don't have much of a background in coral, so I don't have much to add. But yeah, there's a lot of people are looking at trying to grow some variants of corals that are more resistant to warm water. And I just put another link in the chat because being a part of the National Marine Sanctuary System, I know that Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary recently published their restoration blueprint, and that probably has some up-to-date information if someone wants to dig a little further into that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I've been in communication with Cara, one of your colleagues, I think, Jennifer Smith, Dr. Jennifer Smith, and she's really leading a lot of projects down at Scripps on coral, and we're hoping to have her become part of our speaker schedule this year. So to be continued.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Another question. This is from Mark. In relation to the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, do you think that the former administration's attempted lease granting for companies to start and resume drilling will be successfully stopped by this new administration's efforts?
Well, I hope so. Certainly. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was protected one way or another for many decades, for quite a long time. And it was only in the last administration that protection was broken and leases were issued. So I hope so. I guess one of the things I'm learning, and I'm not a politics expert, is though that our new administration, if they want to make lasting change, have to find ways to go outside the envelope of executive change, executive order change, because we're hearing now, as you all are hearing probably, that these changes can be, executive orders can be turned over administration by administration. So we need legislative change to protect these valuable places it's hard to talk about these things when you don't feel like you have a strong expertise, but my opinions are that with the Arctic Refuge and the Arctic oil resources in general they are literally a drop in the proverbial bucket of oil resources on the planet. Yet they represent some of they're in areas that are some of the most extraordinary remaining Arctic coastal habitats in the world, polar coastal habitats in the world. And so I'm not so cynical, or as, hypocritical as to say there couldn't be circumstances when those resources may be needed by society, by the world in general, but I should think they would come up on a list near last compared to other places in the world where we extract oil for whatever reasons we extract it. Everywhere has its consequences. There is no place you get it without risk. But when you talk about such a small amount of that habitat left on the planet, as big as the Arctic Refuge is, as big as the coastal plain is, it seems to me that we should make a priority of keeping it in place unless it's a last resort. And it seems to me like it's going as an economic driver based on immediate needs of businesses and even the state of Alaska's government, if I could be so bold, and so other things, to have large amounts of oil extracted from its state, from those areas. So just personal opinion drifting there, but I hope so. And I hope that this administration can make legislative change that reduces or affects how we extract offshore and onshore Arctic oil resources.
Thank you, Mark. One more question about marine mammals. One of our participants is wondering if you are aware of any new studies of marine mammals in relation to their resilience to climate change, specifically.
I guess I could start again just by saying I have not seen any new papers. Not to say that there are not. I'd love to see one. If there is, I think most of the papers I'm coming into are about challenges to resilience that change is posing, concern about resilience, and also adapting to changes like poleward shifts. We're seeing more and more information come out about shifts in marine organisms, for example, into polar or more poleward directions as warming continues and goes on and increases. Our bottlenose dolphins may be an example of that. We're not sure what's driving their movement further north entirely, but there are challenges or concerns about resilience for everything from, you might say that marine mammals, one hand you might say marine mammals are very mobile, most of them can and do often travel over vast amounts of ocean in search of their life history, their where they go to have their young and where they go to find their food, and they're mobile and they can move and find new resources. However, a contrast to that was that you could also think of their lives as acutely timed events, even migratory whales, where they go to certain places to have their calves, they deplete themselves in the process of raising their calves, like for gray whales. They make their way north on their last reserves of energy, and they hope to emerge in the spring in a bountiful Arctic habitat to replenish themselves and get their calf to size to wean. And if that isn't then present and available at that particular time, then the whole kind of house of cards comes down, or it has the potential to come down. Or we might see the first signals of that might be decreased reproductive success, or calf mortality, or pup mortality in the case of pinnipeds, or otters or such. So sorry I don't mean to be negative. I guess we're trying to be upbeat about a lot of this, and there is a lot of stuff to go positive on, but we do still have an emerging problem. And I think more than anything, most of our marine mammals probably don't have the resilience we would hope for, or some of the things you might think of, like this mobility factor, might be countered by other constraints of their life history and what it takes to pull off a successful life or year or life and ability to reproduce enough to adequately replace themselves. So, and keep their populations whole or growing or returning is what we hope. So since so many of them were depleted by whaling and sealing in past centuries.
And just to build on that, Mark, I think your point is really well taken about animals that are range across thousands of miles versus those that are more local. And we may be able to start drawing more important and different conclusions from species that are confined to more restricted areas, like the southern sea otter, for example. And you all probably know that southern sea otters, all sea otters are a really important ecosystem, keystone species basically in ecosystem. So when they're absent, we know that a lot of urchin populations have taken over, and we end up with depletion of kelp forests. And we know how important, as Sarah mentioned, kelp forests are a really critical part of our environment for many reasons. Obviously, they convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. They provide really important shelter for many species. So sea otters have an incredibly important economic role, and they're relatively short-lived. And so when we start to see the otters having sort of a static population, which is where they are now, we have to ask ourselves, why are they not growing and thriving? What factors are going into that? Are they being resilient enough in this changing environment? So certainly their food and prey availability is going to limit that. Presence of disease, presence of other factors. So for our southern otters, they run into a lot of sharks at the northern end of the range here around San Francisco area. So all of these factors come into play. And so our local species might be a really good indicator of resilience and how marine mammals are handling that. And southern sea otters are certainly well studied. Hawaiian monk seals, similar kind of thing. The porpoises, harbor porpoises that have come back to San Francisco Bay might also prove to be a really important indicator here in the Bay as well. So continuing to study and understand what's going on with these animals and causes of death and overall population shifts will certainly help us better see how resilient they will be in the upcoming decades.
Susan, if I could add something at that point too, if you don't mind, just staying on this for a moment. Are we okay?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make following on what Cara said, and it's real important because the sea otters she's talking about in California are genetically different from the sea otters in Alaska. And the California coastal bottlenose dolphins I mentioned earlier are genetically different from all other coastal bottlenose dolphins in the world. So we often talk about conservation of species, but to me, that's kind of skimming the surface a little bit, because where conservation impact has to happen and where our concerns, I think, have to also reach and expand our scope are for these genetically distinct populations, these unique assemblages of what is a bottlenose dolphin or what is a sea otter. I was having this conversation today with one of my colleagues, Bill Keener. There are coastal bottlenose dolphins south of the California coastal bottlenose dolphins. So if something happened to these guys, wouldn't some other coastal bottlenose dolphins infiltrate into the area eventually and take over? They might, but they would also be different. And we would have forever lost a unique signature of what is bottlenose dolphins, a unique element of what is the diversity of bottlenose dolphins. So what I was when you asked me, Susan, in the preliminary questions, what are some of the species I was most concerned about? Some have been mentioned. Cara mentioned monk seals. One of mine on my list was the Cook Inlet beluga. Not that there aren't a lot of belugas in the world, but there aren't a lot of Cook Inlet belugas. And those are different than all other belugas. And they're trapped in the Cook Inlet system, which gets to a point Cara made about animals inhabiting smaller systems like bays and estuaries, coastal strips of habitat, rivers, like river dolphins and such. Animals that are in more restricted places without communication with others are also much more vulnerable under any kind of scenario of change, often at least, unless the change is incredibly favorable for them. So I was going to mention one of my key species was this Cook Inlet beluga, or types. It isn't really a distinct species, but it's a genetically distinct population segment of what is beluga whale. So we have to think about conservation at many levels, not just at the species level, but at populations that matter to us and to the health of all of bottlenose dolphins, or all of beluga whales, or all of sea otters.
Yeah, and what a thrill to see those that particular population of beluga whales at Cook Inlet. Wow, that's one of my happiest memories in terms of marine mammals. Yeah, and I wanted to say, to the point about the keystone species of the sea otter, I'm sure maybe many of you have been reading that there's a initiative underway to reintroduce the sea otters of our area to one of their original habitats, San Francisco Bay, which would be pretty exciting.
Okay, I think we've wrapped up most of our questions. One kind of fun question that I don't know if any of our panelists can provide a recommendation for. It's not really related to marine mammals, but maybe in your research efforts, you've needed a great vehicle that can climb the Sierras. Someone is saying, I need a new vehicle. I think they're thinking about electronic vehicles, wondering if anyone has a recommendation for a great vehicle to climb the Sierras and dirt roads. We can close with that question. Any responses to that?
Legs.
The most sustainable option, right?
Yeah.
Sled dogs. Sorry, no, I'm not sure. I don't have a great answer to that, unfortunately, but certainly maybe something along the lines of a hybrid might be.
Yeah, right.
Where they're getting better and better every year.
That's right.
As are the electric vehicles, of course, too.
Yes. Well, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone who chimed in with their questions and their suggestions. We really appreciate all of your engagement and ideas and feedback. So thank you for that. Susan, any last comments or thoughts that you'd like to close with, or would any of you like to close with any last thoughts before we end our panel today?
Yeah, I'll defer to any of our panelists. Any closing thoughts or comments?
I just want to say thank you to everybody. It's wonderful to meet new people in the marine mammal and aquatic community that are so vested and interested in trying to help this world be a little bit better. So thank you all for listening and for spreading the word about how we can all affect change.
I enjoyed this very much. Thank you. It was great to hear the questions and perspectives on, especially on things that I don't study and spend as enough time, I think, as I need to studying sustainability and things that we can do that are different and helpful rather than contribute to the problem, be part of the solution. I'm glad to hear things. Opportunities and information is welcome.
Thanks, everyone. I learned a lot, especially about marine mammals, not my strong area. So thanks for sharing. And maybe if each of us can have a couple conversations in the next week or so with some folks to spread some of what we learned, I think that is probably the single most effective thing we can do at this point, is talk to our neighbors, talk to our friends, our family about what concerns us about climate change and start brainstorming some of those solutions.
And Sarah, we'll definitely want to hear back more about those crazy ideas coming into fruition in terms of the innovation ahead. So thank you, panelists, so very much for giving us your time and sharing your thoughts and knowledge with our community. And I know this is just a topic that I think the best way to end it is just to say to be continued.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Your help too, Gail. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.